So when I first joined the Missionaries of God's Love, we had a very strict routine about things in the mornings for morning prayer. So those days we started prayer at 5:30 in the morning, and I think maybe because I was the last to join, I drew the short straw, and that meant that I had to be in the shower at 5. There were about a dozen of us in the house, and there were 3 bathrooms, so there was a very clear routine. So I needed to be first, and if I was late, that messed everybody else up. And it was only maybe a few weeks in that I walked into the shower, into the bathroom rather, and I'd only been awake about a minute and a half, and I walked in, and then from the bathtub came a voice saying, "G'day, brother." You can imagine how fast I got out of the bathroom. It was a complete stranger, and it was only sometime later afterwards, obviously, that I learnt who this was. So his name was Jeffrey, and Jeffrey was a really interesting character. He was an inveterate walker. He was homeless, he didn't have a home, and he would just keep going between cities and towns, and you could hear reports of Jeffrey being in all sorts of places from people that we knew, but when he came to Canberra, he would show up at our place and he'd get a feed and a bed. He obviously could turn up at all times of the morning or night. I had no idea when he arrived that first morning that I met him. I remember another time when he came, and he had a number of probably both diagnosed and undiagnosed mental health conditions, and he loved watches. And so you'd be talking to him for a little bit, and then his eyes would go to your watch. And I remember him doing that one day, and I said, "Jeffrey, would you like my watch?" And he said, "I would, brother." And it was only maybe 15 minutes later I saw my watch on one of the other MGLs, and Jeffrey had a different watch. I remember another time where the doorbell went, and we had one of those doorbells. Some doorbells these days where if you press it once, that's as much as you can press it for. We had one of those doorbells, if you hung on the doorbell, it would keep going. So 3 o'clock in the morning, the doorbell goes, and so there's a long corridor, and I came out and I could see 2 of the priests in front of me. I was the 3rd person out, and to my shame, I realised it was going to be Jeffrey, and I turned around and went back to bed and left the ministrations to Jeffrey, to the 2 priests. I was in trouble about that the next day for my lack of mutual care and support. One of the most noticeable times, or noteworthy times, a memory that I'll always have is the police bringing Jeffrey to our place one day during the day, and it was a stinkingly hot day, like well into the 30s, maybe even higher, I think. And the police had found Jeffrey on the side of the road, maybe 80 k's out of Canberra, and he'd fainted from the heat, and he'd landed on the bitumen, and the tar was so hot there was actually still a little bit of tar on his forehead, like it had actually melted. It was awful. And when he'd been revived by the police and they said, where do you want to go, he'd given them our address. And so Jeffrey came there, and obviously we looked after him and tried to care for him in that moment. He'd usually only stay a day or 2 at the most, and then he'd get kind of he'd get toey, and he'd go off and he'd hit the road again. I moved to Melbourne and started my studies for priesthood, and I do remember coming back to Canberra maybe a year or 2 after I'd last seen Jeffrey, and I ran into him. He'd come for a visit, but this time Jeffrey looked really different. He'd come with an Anglican minister who lived a couple of suburbs away and who was doing an unusual, maybe an alternative kind of form of ministry, where he basically had a house and he just opened up his house to 3 or 4 people who would otherwise have been homeless and needed particular care. And so Jeffrey's teeth had been capped, and he was wearing really good clothes. They'd sorted out the medication that he needed, and so I had the longest and clearest conversation I would have had with him over the whole time that I'd known him. It was a beautiful moment, I think, of 2 things that I really want to pick up. Obviously, there's something there about the wonderful care that this Anglican minister gave to Jeffrey, but also the friendship. the relationship that was there. Jeffrey wasn't a problem to be solved or a situation to be, for money to be thrown at. He was a person and a friend to this priest, to Father Michael. I share that story because the social justice statement for this year that the Catholic bishops of Australia have given to us is focused upon people who are homeless and especially who are also suffering from mental ill health. There are other stories in that social justice statement of real people and their experience of homelessness and living with mental health issues. I chose that story because it's obviously one that I know well, my story. Or Jeffrey's story, more to the point. In the social justice statement, it says that 273,000 people here in Australia sought help from homeless services over the past year. It's an awful lot of people, huh? They're the people who sought help. And it also makes the point that people are often just one adverse life experience away from severe housing stress, from the real risk of losing their home. Losing a job, falling ill, becoming a carer, ending a relationship, family and domestic violence, being on a temporary visa. Any or all of these, and especially if there's a combination of a couple of those, can mean that people are really in real danger of losing their home. If you add into that the cost of living pressures that we currently have in a place like Sydney, that stress is very, very real. The social justice statement also talks about the fact that people with mental health issues are a significant representation of those who are seeking those services and help, but often this group of people is very much overlooked and undercared for. Now, there are a number of great initiatives from Catholic organisations like Vinnie's, St John of God and others, as well as other broader community agencies that are dedicated to alleviating homelessness in our country. But the social justice statement rightly says that we can't leave that to the professionals, as it were, that by virtue of our baptism as Catholics, we're responsible too, that we've got a part and a role to play. This is a quote from the social justice statement. The credibility and authenticity of our commitment to follow Jesus hinges not just on our willingness to humbly wash the battered and bruised feet of our world, but to enter into relationship with those whose feet we wash. In the scriptures today that we've just been listening to, we heard in the psalm, the refrain, the antiphon of the psalm was, God, in your goodness, you have made a home for the poor. The psalm goes on to say, God gives the lonely a home to live in. It recalls the Exodus story when the people were starved. And it says, you, God, gave the people new life. It was there that your people found a home, prepared in your goodness, O God, for the poor. Then in the gospel today, we're told by Jesus that when we have a party, we're to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and that they cannot pay us back means that we're fortunate because repayment will be made to us when the virtuous rise again. A couple of quotes now from recent popes. This is from Benedict XVI. Love for widows and orphans, for prisoners and the sick and needy of every kind is as essential to the Church as the ministry of the sacraments and the preaching of the gospel. The Church can't neglect the service of charity any more than she can neglect the sacraments and the word. And then Pope Francis says, the people on the edges have much to teach us. In their difficulties, they know the suffering Christ. We need to let ourselves be evangelised by them. The new evangelisation is an invitation to put them at the centre of the Church's pilgrim way. We are called to find Christ in them, to lend our voice to their causes, but also to be their friends, to listen to them, to speak for them, and to embrace the mysterious wisdom which God wishes to share with us through them. So obviously just that brief, and there's much more richness in the social justice statement, but that brief kind of picking out of several salient points leads us to the question of, well, what do we do? How do we respond? And here in our parish, there are a number of ways in which that already takes place. There are lots of things that are already happening. Here in the parish, there are 4 Vinnie's night patrol teams that go into the Liverpool area and look after those people, provide food for those people on the streets each night in that area. Every 2 weeks, there are 300 sandwiches, 100 fruit salads and 80 muffins made on a Tuesday here in the parish that go and serve those night patrol visits. We've been having a soup drive over winter for the 2nd year in a row, and I'm told that we made 672 litres of soup. That's 45 different soup makers. And again, on a cold night, a cup of hot soup would be very important for someone who's sleeping rough. Those sorts of services offer an opportunity to provide some level of connection too, because you do get some regulars on those visits. But that would be a great opportunity. Vinnie's is always looking for more people to be involved. We've been asked, not only we try and serve and care for people in this area, we do that also in Liverpool. We've been asked to help in the Bankstown area as well. So that's a very practical way in which parishioners can get involved in caring for people who are both poor and struggling with mental ill health. The social justice statement adds to that though and just says there's something really important about just trying to build relationship and connection. We don't have perhaps the same level of a problem with homelessness in our area than in other parts of our city, although at various points I've met people here on Penshurst Street, down at Oatley Park, who have been sleeping rough. Obviously in other parts of the city that's much more significant. But perhaps as you go to work, as you hop off a train, or as you walk through a part of the city, you actually do see people who are homeless as well. The social justice statement says there's something about being able to get somebody a sandwich and a cuppa in that circumstance, and that a connection can be built. It speaks of a relational poverty as well as a material poverty, and that particularly people who are suffering from mental ill health, their need for relationship is as strong as their need for food and for shelter. So there's some practical things that we might consider and reflect upon when we think about what we might do to respond to the call that the bishops make, but a call that's ultimately grounded, of course, in the words and teaching of Jesus himself. Every time we come to the Eucharist, we're fed by the Eucharist. St John Chrysostom, all the way back in the 5th century, wrote, "The Eucharist commits us to the poor. To receive in truth the body and blood of Christ given up for us, we must also recognise Christ in the poorest, in his brothers and sisters. We cannot say, 'You have tasted the blood of the Lord,' and do not recognise our brother or sister."